Good evening, good morning to everyone. It's a big pleasure to be with all Poultry School audience today. We're very excited about this first presentation. We have been looking for this kind of subject about biosecurity, and we have the pleasure to have with us Jean-Pierre Vaillancourt. He is a professor from the University of Montreal and many other uh, assignments. And we're going to have a very nice presentation today. As always, this webinar is going to be recorded and is going to be accessible in our platforms in maybe 1 week. And the title is One on Farm Biosecurity Often Doesn't Work in the Field. So, Jean-Pierre, the time is yours, and we're going to have a few minutes after the presentation for questions. And Jean-Pierre, thank you very much for your time and for being with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you. And you could see that I added to the title by saying reconciling perception with reality. Basically, this talk today is going to focus on that frustration that many have, that we've been talking for many years about biosecurity, and yet we still have many outbreaks popping up of highly pathogenic avian influenza or reovirus or all sorts of other, laryngotracheitis, and people are saying it just doesn't work. Well, I will make the point that it could work. It's just that in practice, there are some reasons why it doesn't work. And one of these reasons is that people have sometimes a different perception, not only of risk factors or biosecurity measures, but also of reality, what they perceive as being real or not real. That's why I'm giving this talk. It's a prelude to a series of 5 talks that I'll be giving, 5 1 hour, 50-minute talks on basic principles of biosecurity and on sanitation, not only of barns or equipment, but also of water, because this is something that's often an issue. I was in Bangladesh a few months ago and I asked how they treated water, and they said to me they did not treat water because it comes from underground. Well, I had some news for them there. You see, so that's why I'll put emphasis on things like that, on compliance, because it's the main issue, one of the main reasons. I'll be talking a bit about it today, as well as airborne transmission, because it's perceived as being a big deal when it comes to high path AI. And finally, regional biosecurity, what I call the new frontier. It's part of a strategy that we need to develop in some regions if we want to have greater success. And I'm adding these little logos, little symbols that you're going to see throughout my presentation. Let's start with the beginning of text that we have. I'm going back here 2,600 years ago with Deuteronomy. Leviticus is 2,400 years ago. You have other texts like in the Quran and other texts that are not from religious texts, but they all have elements of biosecurity. If you read what's there, I'm not going to do it for you. You see that we can do analogies between what they were prescribing back then and what we're trying to do on farms. In fact, there's nothing happening on poultry farms or other types of farms in terms of biosecurity that is not grounded in things that were done over 2,000 years ago. Another example, going forward about 1,000 years, even more, we're in the Middle Age and we have a problem with leprosy. And so, what they would do back then, this is like 250 to 300 years before we could identify microbes for the first time. They already knew what needed to be done to prevent infectious diseases from spreading. And what I put there is basically a summary of what they call the mass of separation. You can find on the web the original text in Old English or Old French of this mass of separation that would highlight things that people should do or not do. And we can do analogies there when it comes to, dressing in a certain way so that we will know where you belong versus where you should not be. Or this is a bit tricky, you should not share a house with another woman but your wife. Well, an analogy to that could be careful if you're going to introduce other animals on your production site. So all these things, even airborne transmission is considered. I forbid you to, if you are accosted by anyone, set yourself downwind of them. So they already had that, and this is like centuries ago. So I claim that it worked, and yet leprosy today is still doing well. In the Americas, for example, we had over 24,000 cases in 2023, which is amazing because this is not a viral disease. This is something that can be treated, and this is something that we kind of have a good understanding of the reservoir, where it's coming from, right? So the question we would ask ourselves for a disease like that, for example, is what are the conditions leading to that connection between the reservoir and the people or the animals that we're trying to protect? What this is essentially saying, okay, what makes that chain of infection whole? What makes it complete? Because we have the agent, it's in a reservoir, but it has to get out of there and be transmitted to a susceptible host. So, how is that happening? Can we eliminate, for example, uh, the reservoir? Not likely. So, what are the other solutions? When it comes to leprosy, of course, in humans, we all know that social inequalities is a big deal. What is that really? Well, it's the fact that we put people in a situation where they are in direct contact with the reservoir. We have no way, sometimes because of living conditions, to separate the two. Thankfully, we can do that in poultry. So we can use the principles we've learned from centuries and say, all right, we need to reduce the reservoirs. We need to reduce sources of contamination. So that's the first thing. And then you need to bring a separation between these reservoirs or sources of contamination and the flock that we're trying to preserve, to keep healthy. Well, you can do it at two levels. You can separate, like for example, if you have a shower in, shower out facility, the idea of the shower, this is what brings the separation between the contaminated world and the clean world where your animals are, right? And then you have the regional aspect of it, the management of the poultry territory, because we have these farms in a certain region, X number of production sites per square kilometers. How are they set up? What's that biomass? What is the distribution? Do we have ducks as well as chickens and turkeys and egg layers? Depending on that mix, we're going to add different challenges. We need to consider this to address that issue of being separated from the reservoirs. So that's what we know works, and we actually know exactly how to get it done. Yet, we find so many opportunities where this is a problem. Here's an example that's very popular these days: highly pathogenic avian influenza. Look at the risk factors that are there, and you have the odds ratios for most of it. So the odds ratios, if it's over 1, it's a risk. If it's less than 1, it's protective. So in green, I put having an adequate empty room and sanitation material. Well, you see it's less than 1 because it will protect the flock. In some cases, I don't have an odds ratio. So in red, for example, water and litter can be a source of contamination. It's highly significant. I don't have an odds ratio, but we know. For aerosol transmission, We know we can find a virus 70 meters away from an infected flock, but is it capable of traveling a kilometer and still be infective? Well, we don't have very little evidence of that. But you can see all these factors, they have to do with where the infection might be, near a pond, with birds that are outside in contact with wild animals, or they have to do with sanitation. If you actually look at this concept of a reservoir and reducing sources of contamination or separating sources from sources of contamination, you can see that for each one of these risk factors, they either have directly something to do with the reservoir, or at least we can intervene in terms of cleaning, reducing, eliminating, or bringing separation. And you can see that separation is almost a factor or an approach that is useful for virtually all the risk factors associated with highly pathogenic avian influenza. We actually have studies that have been done. This is from a European institution that looked at, they did modelization based on actual data, meta-analysis and all that, and they could show that from doing nothing to having regular biosecurity or high biosecurity, you could have a flock that would technically be exposed to 100 infected wild birds, or there would be a proximity. But if you would do things right, prevent them to be outside, outside access for the birds, or keeping them inside, doing the classic biosecurity, you could reduce the risk by 24-fold for just traditional routine meat bird biosecurity. And for breeders, you could actually reduce the risk 264 times. That's the median reduction. So we have lots of evidence from the scientific publications that these risk factors can be tackled, and we have solutions to greatly reduce the risk. So these biosecurity measures actually are efficacious. It's the application where we have a problem. And there are several reasons for it. The first, the big one, is lack of compliance, in particular, anything that has to do with humans. And that's connected to lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge is partly responsible for repeating mistakes or not applying something because we just don't know. But add another layer to that, which is the discordance between the perception and reality. And that's true for example, how efficacious disinfectants can be, or the role of risk factors like airborne transmission. Right now, I'm based in France, and there I talk to growers, and they all say, look, it's coming with the wind. What can I do? So they're very negative towards that because they say, that's the problem. I cannot control it. When that's not exactly true. Look at the two pictures in the lower right corner. You have a guy trying to disinfect dirt. Another one seems to believe that you can decontaminate the wheels of a truck by putting a carpet, a very short carpet, with some disinfectant on it. These carpets, by the way, they go for at least $800 each, I believe, something like that. It's remarkable that some people may have the impression that this is actually working out, that this is actually useful. I challenge you to find data on things like that. You won't find anything because it just doesn't work. Some of you may have seen this slide. I've shown it in a lot of countries. It has to do with what's the actual compliance level. I had the opportunity with a graduate student, Manon Rassico, who did a superb world where we actually could film inside empty rooms. And so we could tell exactly what was going on. That was with cameras activated with movement. And we could show that half the time The biosecurity, the compliance regarding changing boots to be in contact with the birds, that was not done properly. Or hand washing was just done about a third of the time. Signing a logbook a third of the time. Putting on coveralls, a little bit more respect there, mainly because people didn't want to get dirty. But still, 71%, that's not high. An overall compliance of about 35%, that's not how we can prevent diseases from getting in. Now, I added this percentage of farm compliance not only sucks, but it's not as good as you think. And I'm talking here to people who are higher up in an organization. What I've discovered, I've been a veterinarian in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Europe. What I discovered, if you talk to people in integrated systems, the higher up they are in the system, the more they think that what they order actually happens in the field. That can be true for many things, but for day-to-day biosecurity measures, not so much. And that's why I had this quote from Mark Twain saying, what gets you in trouble, it's not necessarily what you don't know, but it's what you know for sure that is just not true. And the problem is when you're convinced, sometimes it's hard to change people's mind. This is what brings me to talk about human factors and other determinants of lack of compliance. What you have with this list here is what comes from decades of literature on looking at lack of compliance when it comes to biosecurity. And that's true for many other businesses, not only in animal production. There's three parts there. In red, you see what I call the pragmatic, the real thing. Like I don't have time, I don't have the money, I don't have the material. This is like, uh, I don't have the space. So this is the very pragmatic type of issues that will lead to lack of compliance. But then you have the people who are facing these things. What is their attitude? How do they perceive things? What are their intentions? That psyche, including their personal traits, will have an impact on whether or not they will make the effort to follow the measures that we know work. And what will have an impact on their psyche there? It's basically a series of issues that are at the bottom. Something that had to do with leadership, lack of knowledge, inadequate training, incoherent communication, uh, no audits or invalid audits, and lack of positive incentives in particular. You have negative, you have positive. All of this is very important because what the industrial psychologists are telling us is that the way people will do something will eventually have an intention of doing something. That will depend of who they are in terms of personality, but also their emotional intelligence. And what's interesting there is that that can be modified, that can be improved. Where you look at people's motivation, their decision making, their relationships with other people, that's very important because you see down there we're talking about attitude, but also normative belief. Normative belief is this biosecurity stuff, how important is it to my coworkers? How important is it to the owner? Because if I feel that it's not important to them, why would it be important to me? But if I feel that it's important, right away that will have an impact. And perceived control is a key element. Do I feel I have the knowledge, the capabilities, the skills, and actually the material, the support to do what is being asked of me? And when you talk to industrial psychologists, they tell you every single one of the elements that I've mentioned on the left side, they are connected to human factors that we can work on. So typically, people will say, well, I do consider people, that's why we offer training. Well, actually, that's not enough. And first of all, very often, it's not done properly. There's a lot of details. no magic bullet, but just to give you an example of the importance of knowing how to connect with people. This is a study where they had individuals working on farm. They were provided with either verbally being told that you have a shower and shower out facility there, and you have a risk right now that is either very low, low, medium, or high, or 1, 5, 15, 25%, or it would be expressed graphically, with colors, going all the way to red. And they were told at the same time that this was certain, that we were certain there was like a 25% chance that the disease would come in. And or in some scenarios, they would say, well, we're pretty sure, but not completely sure. 70% sure that it will be 25%, for example, a chance of 1 out of 4 that something will happen. And so they would ask people if they would be willing to take the shower or if that would be their behavior. And you see the percentage increase in compliance and at least intention of doing it. It varied not only according to the percentage risk of infection, but also it depended on how that information was communicated to them. Verbally and graphically was much better than giving them numbers. So when we approach people to improve compliance, we need to know how to do it. Going to give you examples from different countries. This is from the UK. They looked at bird catchers and they had identified all sorts of problems there. The catching crew was using the same clothing for more than one farm. Their forklift or their equipment was not being decontaminated. The boots were not being cleaned between farms. The catching crew would sit in the van for the break and then go to another farm. And so they had contaminated the van and all that. So they asked the catchers if they were aware that this was an issue. They actually said, yes, we know. We know, but we can also tell you that we're being told to do things extremely quick, and it's not possible to actually address the issues that you highlighted, that we know are a problem, and at the same time get the job done. And so the catchers were aware of the contradictions, but they also were aware of the reality is they were asked to be fast so that they could basically reach a certain quota for the day or for the night. Uh, the catchers and the farmers, they actually were saying, what is the point? And also, they felt that they were quite resourceful by finding ways of getting the job done, even if they were aware that they would not necessarily address the issues, the risk factors that they knew were present. In that study, they also discovered that to just offer them training or to actually force them to say, we realize you don't have much time, but you absolutely need to do everything. That did not work. That we needed to address basically the source of the problem of the non-compliance. If in this case was lack of time and sometimes lack of equipment. Here are some other examples of problems. In the center, you have an enter room. You have the door, you open that door, look at that contaminated area. I mean, unless you're trained by the Cirque du Soleil, I would like you to tell me how you can come in, mainly if you're 2 or 3 people, and remove some clothing, change clothing, respect the different zones. It's virtually impossible. You see darkening beetles going on either side of the red line. So at one point you say, what's the point? At the bottom, you have a picture of people walking away from a farm. That's actually a farm that had egg layers, breeders. I mean, they had breeders in different buildings. And one of the ladies was pregnant. She could not, and her building had a lot of eggs laid on the floor. She had to pick this up. She was starting to be too pregnant for this, and she told the owner, look, I would need a little bit of help because I've got a situation. And the guy said, look, if you cannot do your job, I'm going to let you go. So what did she do? She asked her husband, who was working on another farm, where there was the same strain of Mycoplasma gallisepticum that we eventually found on that breeder flock. She asked him to help early in the morning before everybody arrived, and he did. But then they got that MG infection, and actually everybody was laid off for a period of time because they had to depopulate. So who's responsible here? The employee or the grower who set up conditions that were not workable? My last example here on the right is requiring many days before somebody can go back to work if they've been to a country where there's a risk. This is a swine example. About 20 some years ago, there was foot and mouth disease in the UK, and in North Carolina, where I used to be, they would say, the pig growers would say to employees, if you're going to the UK, when you come back, you cannot go and work right away on the farm. And so the different companies started to compare one another. And one company decided for 7 days you cannot work on the farm. One who claimed to be much better than everybody else said 14 days. Well, you get to that point, people will lie. They won't tell you that they've been to the UK because they need to go back to work when they come back after their vacation. There are ways of dealing with this, and that's what I'll be discussing in that series that I've been telling you about. But that's another example of unrealistic expectation. That's true all over the place. I was talking about the US. Now this is in Sweden. You know how in Scandinavia they're very good for so many things. We look up at them. They're very well organized. We'll look in a study at the obstacle that have to do with on-farm biosecurity, and you find them same stuff that I've found in Canada, United States, Mexico, elsewhere in Europe, in Africa, and even in Asia where I've been. Lack of what is needed. For example, in the picture you see there, this is the sink. What's in that sink is some material that is in a black plastic uh, cover. As far as having the paper towels, well, that thing was empty. And I have a great collection of images like that. So sometimes, how come it doesn't work? Well, how can it work if we do not have what is needed per se to get the job done? I mentioned not having knowledge. This is from a study in Canada where we actually were comparing 4 different scenarios for decontaminating hens, 3 without water, 1 with water. I'll be talking about this in the second talk that I'll give about sanitation. But I put this slide there to show you 2 things. Half the people out of 37, 19 were foreign and 18 were local, raised in Canada. The foreign employees were not less intelligent than the local one, but they had received less education regarding sanitation, poultry diseases, or diseases of public health interest like Salmonella and Campylobacter. You can see only 1 out of 19 claimed to know about these diseases, and it was more elevated for the other ones. But even then, not everybody knew about this. But look at the last question. When I do not wash my hands, is it is mainly because 90% I do not have what I need to do it. So this is reality on so many farms. Then there's the question of lack of logic. Look, the picture in the middle. What I just highlighted is where this individual who's got a box in his hand had his foot. Now, he's raising his foot because he's got a sprayer to decontaminate his boot. But then he wants to decontaminate the other boot. So what does he do? He puts that decontaminated boot exactly where he was. And if that place was contaminated, he just recontaminated. And how about the picture on the left? What I highlight here is the threshold between the outside and the inside. So here you have people, they put on boots and boot covers, and there's also a foot bath, and there's also a guy who's spraying a little bit, mainly on the dirt, as you can see. So at least they make an effort. Look at them coming out. So you can still see the demarcation between the inside of the farm and the outside, but you can see that they're removing everything while on the wrong side. This removal should be done as they cross from one zone to the next. So we have a problem with the understanding of zoning when we're trying to bring separation. Okay, look at this guy here. I think he had an understanding that this made no sense. That's one reason why he was putting his foot on that boot cover that he had removed. Here's another example. So I'm with some people, but I'm not in charge. I'm just there to observe. This is an individual who had visitors, and he wanted to show them that he was very stringent about biosecurity. So this picture is taken outside of the production site, just next to it, but outside. He said before getting in, we need to put on covers for our shoes and to put on the coveralls. Now, I don't know if you see any kind of zones, but they put all this, they put stuff on the floor and all this, and then they moved on the production site. Imagine if this place is contaminated with highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is a possibility when you have wild birds contaminating. That's usually how, very often, how we think things are happening. Is the environment's contaminated and people just walk, contaminate their boots, and they walk in where the birds are. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. So the intention is there, but the understanding of separation is not understood. Some would say, well, we have foot baths. Those of you who know me know that I'm not impressed by that. Look at the pictures you see there, lower right or on the left. It's impossible to use the foot bath to move between two zones. You have to move on the side or backwards, so that makes no sense. And look at the results from a study where they look at high path and low path AI in a fresh solution or 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours later when you look at a foot bath. And they had good products in there. Quartz with glutaraldehyde. That's a very good combo. And yet you could see that it was positive. This is a virus that's not very resistant, and yet it would survive in the foot bath, contaminating boots. The only case where that did not happen was with bleach powder. So at least foot baths could be useful if it's dry with bleach powder. That could be valuable. But how often do you see this? So this is very important because all these issues, they have something to do with bringing the pathogens all the way to the birds. One thing we want to protect, of course, before we get to the door where the animals are, is the production site, as I mentioned, with my picture of people getting dressed outside of it. And in Canada, we called it the control access zone or CAZ. Okay, we say this is where we don't want necessarily a vehicle to get in if it doesn't have to be there, or people. And if they have to come in, they really need to be decontaminated in some ways. And we know how important that is because of studies like this one in South Korea, where they looked at the attack rate of highly pathogenic avian influenza if you had vehicles that would go in that zone, in particular if they would go from the control access zone of an infected place to another one. And what you can see there is that the attack rate is greater. Essentially, the more you bring vehicles, people close to where the barns are, you don't even need to be in the barns to have a greater chance of having an infection. So some would say, well, okay, but I've got a sprayer to spray the wheels, like the picture you see in the lower right. Well, look at the picture on the left. That's high pressure washing. And here you have the protocol, 4 minutes and a half of low pressure with detergent, high pressure with a disinfectant. Okay. And what you want here, they looked at glass, rubber, metal, or plastic at different places. But here I'm showing you the undercarriage because that's the equivalent of what the man is doing on the right side picture. And even with this high pressure, the whole thing, what you could see is that you had a hard time to lose one log of contamination, when in actual fact, a good decontamination is if you can reduce contamination by 3 logs, like 1,000 times less. Well, we're far from reaching it. So imagine this individual with a garden sprayer. All you do is you get the undercarriage wet, and that, at best, it does nothing. At worst, it will help some contaminated organic material with pathogens to actually fall off when you go on the site. That's a problem. We have a problem also with water. I need to go quickly here, but look at the upper right corner. This is a colleague always tests water for pH when he goes on a farm, and it goes from 5 to 10. What we want to see is a bit acid, but you could see that in a lot of cases he had some basic pHs there, and that's a problem because you can put chlorine, but what's important is the free chlorine and the active chlorine, and that active chlorine will be active if the pH is lower. You don't want to go like at 4, but at least at 6, 6.5, something like that. That will increase the ability of the chlorine to do its job. And we can see it in the oxidoreduction potential is here on the right side for swimming pool, the kill time depending on the ORP results. ORP is very important because for 2 ppm of free chlorine, look at the increase of the ORP. This is the oxidizing potential that's being expressed at 6.5, pH 6.5 versus 8.5. So you can have somebody telling you, I put chlorine in the water, but it's essentially chloramine. It's essentially chlor that's been uh, connected to something else. It's combined. It is not active. We see that often again and again. And here, if you use a testing equipment, the luminometer, that basically can read ATP bioluminescence, you will see there's a very good relationship, correlation between that reading and ORP. So the better, higher the ORP, the better you're going to have an effective decontamination of the water. That's often missed. This particular slide is interesting because right now in France, we're having growers that are meeting with us in a vet in groups of 8 people, and we give them basically little chips, 100 chips, and we say, put the chips where you feel with a list they have, like on a card that you can see there, the risk factors. And I said, the more important the risk factor, the more you put chips on it. And you have 100 chips. So you have a limited number. Please distribute. And look at the risk factors and look at the distribution. Each column is a grower. The last column is a veterinarian. And you can see that they come up with important stuff like bird movement. They say it's very important. Wild birds, you have to understand this is 7 years in a row we have HIPAT AI in France, so they find is very important. But look at dust, aerosol, wind. 4 out of 8, including the vet, determined that this is important. And studies like by Garber has shown that 3/4 of growers are convinced that this is the main thing. By contrast, go up, look at dead bird disposal. Only 1 out of 8 felt that it was of any consequence. Well, let's look at this briefly. Aerosol, first of all, we have the best case scenario, maybe up to 18% of cases might be connected to airborne transmission. And that is very generous. So it is not most of the time. And this is considering several studies done recently in the United States and Canada and now in Europe. And look here, when we try to find the virus for different studies, different viruses, I highlighted study in Minnesota where they could find the live virus up to 70 meters and potentially 150 meters, but that was RNA, not necessarily live virus. There was one study that could find RNA 100 over 1 kilometer away, but nothing infected. So we have no evidence that it's a big deal, but some people may assume that it is and then do nothing, saying, what can I do? By contrast, look at dead bird disposal. That's a very big deal. Look at rendering. You're 7 times more at risk of HiPath AI if you do rendering and you don't have an adequate protocol for when you're going from where you have the container for where you put the dead birds and when you go back to the farm. Another study said 13 to 22 times greater risk if the container is near the barn. Another study look at wild animals. If they have access, you're over 3 times more at risk. Now, at the same time, I just highlighted if the container is far away, it's on a public road, it's not clear near the barns, then that risk is diminishing quite a bit. It's no longer significant. If you look at salmonella, you actually have a 5-time reduction if wildlife do not have access to the dead animals. At the bottom, this is a study that look at how cows get contaminated, and they found that some growers, they put dead birds on the pile of used litter outside, and that gets picked up sometimes by a dog or another wild animal that will drag it to the field, and that's how botulism can be brought to cows. So we have plenty of evidence that this is important, and yet that is neglected. I'm finishing with a regional aspect of it. You have different countries from Belgium all the way down to the UK and different diseases, including bacteria, E. coli, in the UK, salmonella. In between, you have Gumboro disease, Newcastle, avian influenza, laryngotracheitis. And you can see that proximity is a big deal. The concentration of farms increases the risk. Why? Because between two barns, between two farms, you may have the wind, but you'll have flies, you'll have insects, you'll have wildlife. One of the biggest vermin that I say is humans, called it Ratus humanus, that will often go to different places and contribute. Movement of animals. There's a lot going on when you have a high concentration, and we have so much evidence of that. What I want to pinpoint here is that proximity is a big deal, but also time. This is a study on infectious bursal disease or Gumboro, where you look at the spatial-temporal interaction, and you can see that in time, if you have an infection close in one site and there's a site very close to it, it's close in time and space, the risk is so much higher. So when we want to bring separation, we must also consider time. For example, on some farms, in some places, what they've done, if there's some vehicles, they can afford not to use them for a day, to put them aside. Okay, dryness, everything will contribute to reduce the risk of contamination of that vehicle. If it's got contamination, time will play a positive role there. So separation is not only distance, but it could be time as well. We have several studies like the one on HiPath AI in France, where they could demonstrate that the density of bird duck movement was a big deal and the density of duck production sites. So again, the number of sites per square kilometer was a big deal. In Georgia, here you have the dissemination factors for ILT, laryngotracheitis. Of course, there's the fact that it's a long incubation period, but you have also inadequate biosecurity and transportation. They have demonstrated that if the buildings, the flocks are within 300 meters of a road where there's poultry transportation, the risk is higher. Live and dead bird management, litter management, big deal. Flock thinning, which is basically picking up some of the flock, going to the slaughter plant, and going back a week or 2 weeks later. Well, I put that in parentheses because this is so bad doing this that it's now illegal in Georgia. But what you see is in their approach, they say, and then we vaccine, and then we try to control the litter management to prevent further spread. Yes, when you have several outbreaks, that's what you should do. But a lot of these decisions of managing live dead birds and the litter can be done to prevent, not only if you have outbreaks, to minimize the number of outbreaks, but to prevent to have the first outbreak. So I'm finishing with this. Essentially, this is in Spanish. I'll put to you in English. There you go. The thing about biosecurity is the principles are simple, but we're always confronted with the reality of each specific site. And each site is within a given region, and it all comes with its set of challenges, risks, and solutions. I'm aware of that. But no matter where we are in the world, there are some universal elements that we need to consider in a strategy. So, what I just mentioned has to do with knowing the risk, knowing what to do and where and how, and reaching the right people to do things. Make sure things can be done easily. That helps a lot with compliance. Having proper incentives, the proper training, because we're training adults, we're not training children. They need to know why things are important. We need to innovate because technology is very important and will take greater importance pretty soon. And having this regional consideration. All these are part of elements that I will highlight in that series of biosecurity talk that is coming. And I will throw in as well what they do in swine, including what they call the next generation biosecurity, where they looked at direct, indirect routes, feeding, all these different aspects that have to do with having the proper strategy to minimize risk. Thank you.
Jean-Pierre, thank you very much for your presentation. I really, really like it. And one of our goals in Poultry School, our main vision at some point is putting together all the academic research and knowledge, but with the practical. And I think that the material that you're sharing has that mentality, has that approach. It's not just the academic or the research, but you have the experience to be inside the farms with the boots and going into facilities and get that experience, and also the feedback from the growers. And I think that's the question that the industry needs to be proposing these conversations that right now they are very needed in these times. Biosecurity and healthy, I think, is a subject that we need to be tackling more. So I
I
think
agree.
that we don't have questions right now. So as you say, we're preparing some material, and we're excited to be doing more collaboration with you and Pierre. Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience that was with us this hour, and for all the people that is gonna be watching this video. And let's keep the collaboration going, Jean-Pierre. And thank you very much for your time and your willingness to share your knowledge, that I think is very important and has a lot of value to the industry.
You're
Okay?
most welcome.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.